In October 1973, Arab nations flipped a switch and the United States ran out of gas. Not figuratively, literally. Stations ran dry, lines stretched around blocks. The government rationed fuel by license plate number. Nixon declared a national emergency. Washington swore it would never happen again. So they carved out underground chambers along the Gulf Coast and filled them with 714 million barrels of crude oil. They called it the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, America's insurance policy against the next embargo, the next war, the next crisis. For nearly 50 years, it held. Then in 2022, with an election approaching and voters furious about gas prices at $5 a gallon, 172 million barrels walked out the door. The reserve now holds less oil than it did when Gerald Ford was in the White House. The enemies watching this are not staying quiet. And the people paying for it, that's you. Before we get into what happened, you need to understand what the Strategic Petroleum Reserve actually is, because the way it gets covered in the mainstream press makes it sound like a gas station the government can tap whenever prices get inconvenient. It is not that. The SPR was designed for one specific scenario, the kind of supply disruption that paralyzes a modern military and crashes a civilian economy simultaneously. A war in the Middle East, a coordinated embargo, a hurricane that wipes out Gulf Coast production. The reserve is not an economic management tool. It is a national security tool. That distinction matters more than anything else in this story. The 4 storage sites sit in Texas and Louisiana using underground salt caverns, some nearly a mile deep, because salt is impermeable and self-sealing. Crude oil can sit in those caverns essentially indefinitely. This is not a warehouse you restock in a weekend. The engineering required to pull oil out and inject it back in operates on timelines measured in months, not days, which matters enormously when we get to the refill problem. At full capacity, 714 million barrels, the SPR represents roughly 150 days of import protection under normal demand conditions. That is the cushion between a supply shock and national paralysis. But here is the context nobody gives you. The reserve was already well short of full capacity when 2022 began. The historical peak was 726 million barrels in 2009. By early 2022, it was sitting around 593 million barrels. Years of modest drawdowns and deferred refilling had already eaten into the buffer before a single barrel of the big 2022 release went out the door. The margin was thin going in. Then they made the withdrawal of the century. In March 2022, the Biden administration announced the largest emergency release in the SPR's 47-year history, 180 million barrels over 6 months. The stated justification was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which had tightened global oil markets and pushed American gas prices toward $5 a gallon in significant parts of the country. The Ukraine angle was real, but the timing tells a more complete story. The midterm elections were 8 months away. Gas prices were the single biggest driver of voter anger. The administration needed relief at the pump before November, not after it. The SPR release delivered that relief. Prices dropped. The midterms came and went. By fall 2023, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve hit 347 million barrels, the lowest level since 1983. To understand the scale of what that represents, consider the comparison. In 40 years of genuine crises, wars, natural disasters, and financial collapses, the United States never let this reserve fall this low. Not during Desert Storm in 1991, not during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, not during the 2008 financial crisis, not during the first wave of COVID in 2020. It took one election cycle. But the drain is only part of the story. The question of where some of that oil actually went is the part that should make you put down whatever you're doing. In summer 2022, as barrels were actively leaving the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, a subsidiary of Sinopec, the Chinese state-owned oil company, purchased approximately 950,000 barrels of crude from the SPR through a competitive bidding process. The Department of Energy confirmed the sale when pressed. The political uproar lasted about 72 hours and then evaporated from the news cycle entirely, which is itself a remarkable fact about the state of American political attention. Here is the argument the sales defenders will make, and it is technically accurate. Commodity markets are global. Oil flows where prices dictate. The bidding process was competitive, and the Sinopec purchase represented a fraction of the total release. All of that is true. None of it addresses the strategic question underneath it. The SPR was purchased by American taxpayers and maintained at American expense. It was designated as emergency supply for American crises. Selling any of it at any price to a company controlled by a strategic competitor that is simultaneously building its own emergency reserves is a category error that has nothing to do with how commodity markets work. China has been aggressively expanding its own Strategic Petroleum Reserve since 2004. Estimates put Chinese SPR volumes somewhere between 500 and 900 million barrels, a range that wide because, unlike the United States, Beijing does not publish transparent inventory data. They are building. They have been building for 2 decades. They buy low, store high, and say nothing about what they have. During the same period that the United States was depleting its reserve for domestic political reasons, China was using every global price dip to add to theirs. One country is accumulating strategic leverage. The other sold some of its stockpile to the accumulator. That is the geopolitical ledger as it actually stands. The administration did announce a refill program. The Department of Energy established a purchase price target of around $72 per barrel, intended to buy oil back when market conditions made it affordable. The problem is arithmetic. 172 million barrels left the reserve. The physical infrastructure, the pumps, the pipelines, and the injection rates the caverns can handle allows for roughly 3 million barrels per month of refill capacity. At that pace, replacing what was released takes nearly 5 years of uninterrupted effort. That is not a political projection. It is a mechanical constraint. 5 years, across at least one presidential transition, multiple budget cycles, and whatever geopolitical crises arrive in the meantime. None of those variables are guaranteed to cooperate. There is also the cost problem that gets almost no coverage. The oil in the SPR was largely sold when crude prices were running between $80 and $120 a barrel. The refill buying has been happening at lower prices, which sounds efficient until you account for the strategic cost of having had 172 million fewer barrels of national security cover for 2 full years while adversaries watched and adjusted accordingly. And there is a quieter concern that the engineers are tracking, but that has not become a headline yet. Salt caverns under reduced internal pressure for extended periods require monitoring for structural integrity. The caverns at the 4 SPR sites are not being used at capacity, and the implications of running them significantly below normal operating pressure for extended periods are still being evaluated. It is not a crisis today, but it is a variable that did not exist before the drawdown. Now we get to the part of this story that connects directly to your financial life, because the geopolitical actors paying attention to the SPR drawdown are not abstract. Roughly 21 million barrels of oil move through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That is approximately 20% of global petroleum consumption flowing through a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Iran has threatened to close it multiple times over the past decade, and more seriously during periods of active confrontation with the United States and its Gulf allies. A Strait of Hormuz closure lasting 30 days would, under most serious analytical models, push crude oil toward $150 to $200 a barrel. At those prices, American drivers face gasoline between $6 and $9 a gallon nationally, not in California as an outlier. Nationally. The SPR's historical function in that scenario was to serve as both a physical supply buffer and a market signal. The signal mattered as much as the barrels. It told markets and told adversaries that the United States could absorb a short-term supply shock long enough for military and diplomatic tools to take effect. That signal depends entirely on the credibility of the inventory behind it. With the reserve sitting 172 million barrels lower than it was 3 years ago, that signal is weakened. And the actors who might one day decide to test American resolve in the Strait of Hormuz, or in the waters around Taiwan, or in the energy corridors of Eastern Europe, are watching the inventory numbers the same way you would watch a poker player's chip count before deciding whether to call their bluff. Russia's conduct in Ukraine has demonstrated something the West spent a decade refusing to accept. Energy is the most effective economic weapon available in modern great power competition. Europe understood this in 2022 and 2023 at a cost that is still being paid. The United States managed to buffer itself partly through record domestic production and partly through the SPR release. That buffer is now spent. The domestic production picture is real but politically fragile. And the next disruption, wherever it originates, arrives into a reserve that has not recovered from the last one. This moves from geopolitics into your actual bank account faster than the political class wants you to understand. Energy prices are not siloed to what you pay at the pump on Thursday morning. They are embedded in the cost of everything that moves, everything that is grown, everything that is manufactured, and everything that is heated or cooled. When crude prices spike, the cost structure of the entire economy ratchets upward, and the transmission is not slow. It is fast. The inflationary surge of 2021 and 2022 had multiple causes: supply chain disruption, excess monetary stimulus, labor market tightening. But energy was the accelerant that moved through the system faster than any other input. It hit food transportation costs within weeks. It hit fertilizer prices, which are petroleum-derived, within a season. It hit manufacturing costs, utility bills, and consumer goods within 2 quarters. The Fed spent nearly 2 years fighting the aftermath of a supply shock that energy amplified. With the SPR at a 40-year low, the next energy shock, whatever triggers it, hits an economy that has less capacity to absorb it. The reserve's function was precisely to flatten those spikes, to give markets enough certainty that traders did not have to price in a worst-case scenario at the first sign of trouble. That function is degraded right now. If you hold broad index funds, a sustained energy shock does not just affect your gas bill. It rolls through your transportation holdings, your industrials, your consumer staples, and your materials exposure simultaneously. Energy sector volatility is one of the most consistent precursors to broad equity drawdowns in supply-constrained environments. That is not analysis pulled from thin air. It is the pattern from 1973, from 1979, from 1990, and from 2022. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was one of the tools designed to interrupt that pattern. Right now, it is 172 million barrels less effective at doing that job than it was 3 years ago. Let's put the numbers on the table that no one in Washington wants to read into a microphone. The current reserve, sitting between 350 and 370 million barrels, depending on when you are watching this, provides approximately 75 days of import protection under normal demand conditions. The design standard for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was 90 days. That threshold was set by the International Energy Agency, and the United States helped write it. It is the minimum benchmark for IEA member nations to maintain as strategic cover. The United States is currently below its own standard. In a serious supply disruption, normal demand conditions do not hold. Military consumption goes up. Civilian panic buying accelerates. Prices spike fast enough to trigger demand destruction in the lower income brackets first, meaning working people get priced out of their cars and their heating before the economic cushion actually deploys. 75 days is also, by no coincidence, almost exactly the amount of time it takes for a geopolitical crisis to either resolve diplomatically or escalate beyond the point where oil markets can recover without structural damage. The SPR was sized to cover that window. At current levels, the buffer for that window is thinner than it has been at any point since the reserve was filled. And refill, remember, is 5 years out at current mechanical capacity. Even with aggressive procurement and favorable prices, the reserve will not be back to pre-2022 levels before the end of this decade under realistic operating assumptions. Here is what this actually means, said plainly. The United States sold down a generational strategic asset for approximately 40 cents of short-term relief per gallon of gasoline before a single election cycle. The asset will take 5 years to replace. The adversaries who observe the drawdown in real time are not operating on 5-year timelines. They are operating on their own timelines, and they have now watched the United States demonstrate that its most important energy security tool can be politically compromised. That is the information they needed, and it cost us 172 million barrels to give it to them. The financial implication for you is not hypothetical, and it is not far off. It is sitting in every energy-linked commodity price you pay, in the vulnerability of the equity portfolio you probably did not know had meaningful energy exposure, and in the inflation risk that remains structurally elevated as long as the reserve is this thin. The people who made this decision are not going to explain any of that to you. They are going to talk about the drawdown that brought gas prices down before the midterms and call it responsible governance. You are watching this because you know the difference. If this channel is part of how you stay ahead of what is actually happening, subscribe. The next video looks at the natural gas infrastructure dependency that Europe has not solved and what it means for American LNG export policy and your energy holdings going into the next 2 years.